Welcome to the 41st Annual Statewide Historic Preservation Conference and this session titled Restoration and Renewal, the Story of Wakáŋ Tipi Center. I'm Carol Carey, the Executive Director of Historic St. Paul, and I'm going to be serving as moderator for the session. As we begin, we want to recognize that Minnesota history spans at least 13,000 years. The vast majority of that time is represented by American Indian history alone. And from that perspective, our urban and rural built environments are very recent. The state of Minnesota, as it's been known since 1858, is within the ancestral homelands of the Dakota and Ojibwa peoples. The 11 tribal nations in Minnesota are partners in advocating for recognition and protection of the state's cultural resources, along with other Native nations with historical connections here. The State Historic Preservation Office is currently in the final stages of completing a statewide historic preservation plan for the next decade. Among other goals, they seek to broaden the scope and equity of historic preservation through identification and historic designation of properties important to tribes and underrepresented communities, including traditional cultural properties, cultural landscapes, archaeological sites, and of course, buildings and structures. We encourage you to be part of this effort, working with others to advance cultural and historic preservation efforts across the state, not streets. Before getting started, there's a couple things that we need to cover. First of all, the session is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing. As a registrant, you will be automatically granted access to the recording after the session is completed. There's going to be time set aside at the end of the session for Q&A, and we'll get to questions as time allows. If you're going to ask a question, please use that Q&A function, not the chat. However, if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please use the chat to report that issue directly. As some of you who have been in the waiting room for a bit are aware, we are unfortunately waiting for one presenter who's having technical difficulties and are short another who is having some family emergency issues that she needed to attend to. And that, unfortunately, is Maggie Lorenz, who is the Executive Director of the Lower Phalen Creek Project and also Director of the Wakáŋ Tipi Center. Maggie's an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwa and also descends from Spirit Lake Dakota Nation. And we're very sorry to be missing her this morning. Also, we are hopefully going to be joined by Franky Jackson, who's a board member of the Lower Phalen Creek Project and Wakáŋ Tipi Center, and the 106 coordinator and compliance officer in the Tribal Historic Preservation Department at Prairie Island Indian Community. We have with us Ketz, who is the CEO and Services Director of the 106 group. If you would like additional information on any of the principles in this presentation, please go ahead and look at the website for the conference. You can find detailed bio information there. And with that, I will turn it over to Ann to introduce and get started on the presentation.
Okay. Well, thank you, Carol. So certainly it's very disappointing Maggie's not going to be with us, and she wanted me to convey her disappointment. But obviously, as we can all appreciate, she's actually had 2 family crises just evolved in the last 24 hours. So our thoughts are very much with her right now. And I'm sure Franky's frantic to try to get online with IT challenges, which we can also all identify with. So I'll do my best to cover the parts of this whole story of Wakáŋ Tipi that they were going to be sharing. Hopefully Franky will be able to join us later in the session so that he can really address a lot of the questions and perspectives from his community and the broader Dakota community. So we're excited to have this opportunity today to just share this story of restoration and renewal. So the purpose of what we're trying to do is really convey something of the Dakota people's relationship to Wakáŋ Tipi from a Dakota perspective, and also just to share practical knowledge about the process of restoring Indigenous relationships to places such as this within existing resource management structures. So it's really trying to give some thought to what you might hear today, how that might help you think about how you approach your various responsibilities and work situations and projects and so forth. So first, we're going to look at just where do we stand right now? What is Wakáŋ Tipi and the Bruce Vento Nature Sanctuary? Because the names of this project have evolved over the last 2 decades. What has that change been over time? And then also what is likely to be happening next. So first, if we just look about where we're standing. So I'm sure this aerial view is familiar to you. This is the Twin Cities area, as we call it today. It's the confluence of the Mississippi and the Minnesota River. And we are becoming very conscious of place names right now. This is an incredibly important issue for all of us. At a minimum, we're aware of it with things like Bidemakaska, but naming places is a big part of the reclamation and the restoration and the renewal of the Dakota presence and the visibility in this whole area, and actually really across the country. Wakáŋ Tipi itself is at the east side of St. Paul, and it is at where the Phalen Creek would have come into the Mississippi River. Again, I'm not a Dakota speaker, so I'm afraid I'm nervous about actually trying to pronounce the names, but we're all beginning to learn that more and more. So the Mississippi River is Wakáŋ, and the White Cliffs are what we would call the bluffs, Imnoiska. So I think we all have, and that are non-Dakota and non-Indigenous, have a lot of learning to do about getting familiar with these names and also feeling comfortable in saying them. This is also a map I wanted to share. Some of you have probably seen it over the years. It was prepared quite a while ago for the Shakopee-Mdewakanton Dakota community. And it shows the Dakota presence along the Minnesota River Valley. And of course, at the north end, you can see where the Mississippi comes into the Bedote area, which is the confluence area. Again, very important with place names and so forth. So then let's just turn and look a little bit about just what is Wakáŋ Tipi and the Bruce Vento Nature Sanctuary. So Wakáŋ Tipi is a cave, okay? And it's located in the Bruce Vento Nature Sanctuary. And the cave, we do know historically, was a place for ceremonies. It has a sacred spring, which is still present. And it also has ancient petroglyphs. There's also a second cave that is actually known as Dayton's Bluff Cave, but it's hidden right now. We believe it still exists, but the entrance to the cave has disappeared over time from sloughing of the bluffs. But Wakáŋ Tipi is very much there, present, and this is a map from the 19th century. Just the layout of the cave. So you can see if you imagine the river, the Mississippi is just to the bottom of where this photograph is. And originally there were railroad yards right in front of the cave. A is the main area. There was a sand beach in there. And then as you go back in, there are different caverns and large spaces. This is just one example of the petroglyphs that were found within the cave at the main entrance in the dome of the entrance to the cave. And these original drawings are on file at the Minnesota Historical Society. And then this is, I say, within the Bruce Vento Nature Sanctuary. So some of you may have already been down here. It's actually, if you're going east along Kellogg Boulevard and 3rd Avenue towards the Metropolitan State University, it's right below you. So I would definitely encourage you to go down there. It's been a remarkable story of restoration of highly contaminated area from the railroads. And it's been restored to dry prairie, bluff prairie, oak savanna, woodland, and floodplain forest. The wetlands have been brought back, and there's a lot of ongoing work to really return native wildlife to this area. So what is being reclaimed and restored? All kinds of things. So certainly just the connections to the land itself, the respect for the water, the plantings that are there, and so forth. Ceremonies are now coming back. Dakota people are coming and having ceremonies in this place. There's a greatly increased sense of responsibility for the land. It's also becoming a place where knowledge can be passed on beyond just in meeting rooms and books and so forth. And there's a lot of controls now about what's happening at this place. Though I did notice just I'll share with you later on the Lower Phalen Creek Project Wakáŋ Tipi website. And they reported, you may have seen this in the news, that in late August there was a railroad, a rail car derailment that poured contamination back into the sanctuary. So it isn't just something in the past. It's an ongoing effort to try to reclaim and restore this landscape. I'm going to just touch a little bit on what has happened and the changes over time, so you can get a feel for just how dramatic the changes have been. So originally, Phalen Creek came down into the Mississippi River, and then the railroads came through. This is Lower Landing in 1865, looking east towards the bluffs. So the cave is at the far end of this image. This is another example from a lithograph of the railroads coming through and the bluffs behind the houses and the buildings and so forth. There's also a whole series of buildings that were put in during the whole throughout the 19th century with this whole push for industrialization. So there was a sawmill. There were two sawmills, actually. There was the North Star Brewery, and Jacob Schmidt, a well-known brewer, lived there. There were brewers' homes. They actually used one of the caves in the bluffs to store the barrels. So that's what's called their North Star Brewery Cave. There's the Dayton's Bluff Cave that I mentioned, that it's parts at least of that still survive, but it's so hidden that nobody's made any efforts to try to open it up, and that's probably just fine. There are shanties, there was a lion house, and then as you can see at the bottom right-hand side, there was what was called Carver's Cave, which is the European name for Wakáŋ Tipi, that's at the very southeast end of the project area. And then this, of course, is a familiar type of map, the Sanborn Fire Insurance map. So this gave us a lot of information about the whole layout of the brewery and so forth. And there was archaeological work done many years ago when there was EPA and National Park Service funding to restore this sanctuary. Then in 1913, there was a lot of interest and the caves were reopened. And these are just a range of photos from that time. Then it was closed up. And in 1977, St. Paul Parks decided they wanted to reopen it. And so they brought in the backhoes and just started reopening it. And a number of Native American people in the cities heard what was happening and were pretty upset that it was being done in this way. And so there was a great deal of conversation and actually demonstrations. And finally, the city realized that it was not appropriate what they were doing. And so they closed up, they stopped and they closed up the cave and put a large metal gate across the entrance of it. Then in the early 2000s, the Lower Phalen Creek Project, which is very much a grassroots community organization, primarily based in the East Side, set up, created the organization in order to work at restoring the land to become a sanctuary. In the process of doing that, the Section 106 was needed because there was both EPA and National Park Service funding. And so as part of that, we started to really investigate the history of this place, what was known, what was not known, where there was potential. And in this picture, the gentleman in the red shirt is Leonard Wabasha from the Shakopee-Woodwakaton Dakota community, and John Amphenson on the left, who of course was representing the National Park Service. And this is the beginnings of trying to pull back a lot of the dirt and the slough that had fallen in front of the gate. There was a great deal of consultation among many, many parties, and everybody agreed that the gate would stay there, but the soils in front of it and the dirt would be moved away, and the area opened up. And actually what happened was a really remarkable day, that as the dirt and the soils were moved back, it opened up the springs. So the water just suddenly started flowing. It was a really powerful moment. Even though the gate here looks pretty ugly, it was decided in order to protect the cave itself that this would stay in place, and a wetland was created in front of it. And this is still there now. It's just much more overgrown. It doesn't look quite as raw. So again, I encourage you to go down and be there. It's a wonderful place for just quiet contemplation. So what happens next? So as Carol mentioned at the beginning, Maggie is director of the Lower Phalen Creek Project group, and also is director of this new Wakáŋ Tipi Center. So it's very close now to opening and starting construction and so forth. So these are just some of the plans. And to orient you again, I was mentioning that if you drive along Keller Boulevard onto the 3rd Avenue, you can see where the road is and what you will be able to look down and see. So there's been some wonderful work done in the development of this center, and a lot of excitement about the stage that it's at now. And a lot of the design work was led by Sam Ulrichsen from Full Circle Indigenous Planning. In addition, we've been looking at just some interpretive principles and starting to think about what exhibits are going to go into that center. So it's not a visitor center or a museum, it's a community gathering place, but there is a desire to have some interpretation. And so we have been working with many stakeholders to come up with these interpretive principles. So they include "we are all related." The idea of returning back home here is very powerful. The idea of restoration and renewal, very definitely of the land itself, but also culturally and historically. It's also a place that's going to continue to be a place for sharing wisdom that has been gained over time. And it's also a really powerful, effective way of reminding everybody that Dakota people and Native American people, we are still here. It's a very, very important message for everybody. So what's to come? As I mentioned, the actual construction of the center is going to be starting soon. Within that, there will be exhibits developed, and the programs that will take place there are being developed. And also, Prairie Island Indian Community is planning to, we'll be working with them to develop a nomination to actually list Wakáŋ Tipi on the National Register of Historic Places. It's already been determined eligible, of course, but it's very exciting, I think, that the Prairie Island community is going to be sponsoring actually getting this place listed. So before I close, I just want to do a specific thank you. There have been so many people involved in this project over, really, it's more than 2 decades. So very much it's been an ongoing collaboration between the City of St. Paul and the Lower Phalen Creek Project that continues. The Trust for Public Land was instrumental at the very beginning in negotiating the transfer of the land from the railroads to the city. Certainly the National Park Service was very heavily involved at the beginning because of the funding and the Section 106 review, but as also John Amfinson had a tremendous personal interest in this project as well. The DNR have been involved because, again, this was about ecological land restoration. And then particularly of thanks, and primarily the Prairie Island Indian community and the Shakopee Mudwakad and Dakota community throughout the life of this project have provided so much sharing and a willingness to be open and talk, and everybody collaborating to really try to make this the best it can be. And really something with a remarkable vision for the future. So again, I so wish that Maggie and Franky could be with us today so they could share their knowledge, their wisdom, their vision for the future. But I would encourage you, if you want more reading, go on the Lower Phalen Creek website. Also, we have some story and further background about just what happened over the years, which I think is helpful, especially to those of you that are preservation practitioners, is how could I do this in my situation? And with that, I will be more than happy to take questions. One thing I would like to do, though, is put a plug in for Lower Phalen Creek Wakáŋ Tipi. There is a fundraiser tomorrow, and it was, unfortunately, it's had to go virtual. It was going to be in person, but for all the obvious reasons of high risk with COVID, it's now virtual. This is it's actually a really fun event, and I would really encourage you to think about supporting the work that they're doing. It is really innovative and pioneering, and again, as practitioners in preservation in Minnesota, and particularly with what Carol reminded us about with the vision and the goals of the new state preservation plan, this is a really important project to be able to provide funding or volunteer support, or however you feel you can contribute to help make this become real. So I think with that, I'll pass it back to Carol if you would like to let me know if there are questions that people would like to talk about. I think you're muted.
There we go. Thank you. Thanks, Anne. And thanks very much for stepping in and hitting in this situation. There are no questions right now. I actually was going to see if I could try to put a link to the online event tomorrow in the chat box so people could connect if they wanted to. I don't know if you have that up. And I don't want to get too far away from the session screen, lest I lose everybody.
Let me just give me a second, and I'll try to I'll try to find that and add it.
And while you're doing that, we have a couple comments. First, thanks for a great presentation. Really glad to hear about the National Register nomination. And a question is it known if any of the petroglyphs are still intact?
Sorry, let me just put in the chat here. Hopefully that's sent. Sorry, I'm having technical trouble myself here. I can't figure out how to send it. The petroglyphs, okay. Certainly in Dayton's Bluff, we've no idea if they survived, but there's no evidence that that cave was actually damaged. It's just covered. With Wakáŋ Tipi, we do know that the front 17 feet of the cave was destroyed, was damaged, seriously damaged by the railroad company. And so it's estimated that probably some of the petroglyphs would have survived that, but we don't know how much. We do know there was a spelunker that went into the caves some years ago, and I don't think he saw any evidence of it, but there hasn't really been a systematic effort to do that. And I'm not sure how much of a desire there is to do that. Again, this is a very sacred space. So I think we have to be very mindful of how far we would go in trying to confirm one way or the other if any of the petroglyphs still survive. It was really, one thing I would like to add about the petroglyphs, though, it was really interesting when we were doing the evaluation of eligibility for both Dayton's Bluff and Wakáŋ Tipi. We spent quite a lot of time working with elders, many of whom have passed now, who were very open in sharing their interpretations of the different petroglyphs in each cave from the sketches that we still have. And they were quite different. They look very different. It was indicated by Chris Leith, who was a former elder who's now passed from the Prairie Island Indian community, that actually the ones in Dayton's Bluff look much more ancient than the ones in Wakáŋ Tipi. But also there was one that's quite distinctive that he shared with us that was actually a prophecy of the coming of the Christian white man. So there's some, it was wonderful that we had that sharing from those gentlemen at the time that we were able to do that. It was actually a really wonderful example of actually Section 106 really doing what it's supposed to do, which is make sure there's that due diligence in capturing that knowledge, because if we had got to that point now, a lot of that information would have been lost. So we were very blessed to have those insights and sharings.
Yeah, and I am going to jump in and just a couple of comments in from the perspective of somebody that full disclosure has been involved with this project since the very early days, when there were a number of really, as Anne mentioned, grassroots neighborhood activists involved in the project, but primarily as an environmental ecological restoration project. And as Anne mentioned, it was the Section 106 review that really brought the Dakota story to the forefront. And I would say, as somebody that was involved initially and have continued supporting the project, both with volunteer time, but also and most importantly, maybe financial support at this point. I think that a lesson to take away from it is that that there was a period of time where it became clear that the story and the project was more and about more than the people that started it. And it was really time to develop stewardship and leadership in the appropriate places. And I think in terms of lessons learned, in some of these cases where there is, a need and intent to expand the representation that we have in our work, it is so important to be able to manage that process and to do that with intention. And I couldn't be happier with the way that the project has evolved. And I really encourage everybody to go down to the site. It's a very special site. And the added layers of significance that have been added to the project are really outstanding. And it's an important project on many levels. So I just wanted to add that in that kind of reflection period of, how does this affect the work that other people are doing? I think that, the lesson is to recognize and share that work with that leadership with the appropriate parties. And in this case, the process really worked. The Section 106 project worked. And as we were going through it, as the project was going through it initially, one of the advantages that we had is that the goals for the project were about restoration, ecological restoration. We weren't building a road. We weren't building a, large development. So it became easier to find a path for the project that would lead into the place that it is now.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. It's good to get some of that sort of history of the evolution from yourself, who lives in this community and has been involved for so long. I noticed there's some questions about the evaluation itself. So yes, it's definitely complete. It was done quite a while ago. And is it available for historians and archaeologists? It's on file with the SHPO. It would be subject to the normal sort of best practices for that, but it has been distributed in different situations. So unfortunately, with Maggie and Franky not on this call, I would sort of defer to them on their comfort level of how public it goes. But again, I think if it's with historians and archaeologists, we have access to a lot of data that we obviously understand is sensitive. Sarah's question about will the nomination include the broader cultural landscape features? I think that's yet to be discussed with Prairie Island and how they want to approach this. So certainly we've had some preliminary conversations that we could just look at this as the cave itself, but it really does make much more sense to go much broader. Obviously, there's a very direct connection to the mounds at the top of the bluffs, but I think the challenge could be is how far do you go, because we start to get close to Bodote and many, many other special places. So I think that's sort of a to be determined how far that goes. And obviously we will be wanting to do that in consultation with the SHPO if this is actually going to get nominated. So we'll see. And in terms of the Section 106 review for the current center, I can't really comment on that. Maggie's really the one leading that at this point. So I don't have anything new to add on that specifically.
Any word, Anne, from Franky?
Nope, I haven't heard anything. I'm afraid it's such a shame. Yep. Oh, here we go. Yes, he just said he could not get in. No, I'm really sorry. It's such a shame. Because the last thing we want is just a non-Dakota person telling this story alone. So, but anyway, I'm glad to have had this opportunity to share it because it is a remarkable project. I would really encourage you, even if you don't want to get involved with the fundraiser tomorrow, though it's a really great place to get more background and understanding of the excitement of the where we're at with this project. But also just look on the website and just some of there's a lot of events going on. They have a monthly newsletter, which is full of great information. It's very inspiring. So I would encourage you to at least sign up for the newsletter. And then I know Franky and Maggie, they would be more than happy to talk with you at other times about just where this project is in the broader planning and how it might affect other development and opportunities around the Twin Cities. The other thing I did want to mention, actually, while we're here, is one of our staff, Regine, is going to be doing a paper with Maggie at the Minnesota APA conference, the American Planning Association conference. I think it's next week, on decolonizing the public engagement process. As you can imagine with this project, there's been a lot of communication, consultation with a big C and a little c. And it's been great experience, but it's very interesting now that the Dakota are in a position where they're really taking control of this project. It is becoming their project. We've been learning a lot about the shift in how to think about public and community engagement and engagement with stakeholders and so forth. So I think this whole idea of decolonizing the engagement process is something that's really going to take on more thought and energy over the coming months and years as we're all trying to figure out what does diversity mean, what does equity mean in the planning work that we do that is so rooted in white, Western, European constructs, including constructs of time and decision-making and so forth. So I think there's a lot of really great conversations to be had over the next few months and years around all of the types of things that we've just touched on today.
Thanks. And there was a question that did come up in the chat. Are you aware of any other projects similar to this around the Twin Cities or Greater Minnesota?
Well, there are certainly organizations who are reaching out really much more effectively with the Dakota community, for sure, like on the Minneapolis riverfront, the Friends of the Lock and Dam is one example. I think the work that's going on right now, we're starting to get into interpretive planning work for Ohe, which is known to us as Pilot Knob. Again, that was another project that was about 15 years ago, was about to be destroyed by a housing development. And it wasn't under Section 106, but there was enough resistance at the state level and by the local community that they stepped up. And again, Trust for Public Land got involved in that. The land has been protected and is being preserved. And the city now wants to look into how to interpret the site. And so the way the project is set up right now, we may be the contracting arm for it and leading it from a sort of logistical process side of things, but really at the heart of the team, it's being led by, it's pretty much an all Dakota team except for us, with the architect, Sam Albixson I talked about, that was the architect for Wakáŋ Tipi. Also Gwen, her last name escaped me. She just became Minnesota's poet laureate, first Dakota person to become the state's poet laureate. So really making sure that Dakota people are leading the effort, not just a token single participant. And so I think that's interesting, what's happening there. I don't know if there are other people maybe that could put in the chat if they're aware of their own projects and things that are going on. I think a lot of people are, I just got back from a state parks conference actually back east, and I think a lot of people are realizing that this is becoming more and more important. It isn't just a neat idea, it's something we actually have to embrace and take seriously. But a lot of people are at different places in knowledge, comfort level, understanding what's involved. So I think it comes back to this idea that I think there's all of us. It's becoming a popular topic that we're seeing in conferences and workshops and so forth, but I don't think we can talk about it too much right now, because we all need help, we all need support in figuring out what's the right way to do this. There's so many ways we can put our foot in it, make mistakes. We have to just accept, you step up, apologize, ask questions, and don't be afraid, because it is hard. There's some serious wrongs that need to be acknowledged and corrected, and our role in them, either in what we represent, who we, and what our role is in decision making now. We want to be very mindful of how that power or position of authority is part of the conversation. So the conversation becomes a really authentic, meaningful dialogue in who is actually making decisions. And that, again, is why I think what the Lower Phalen Creek Project did is really remarkable, in that they listened, they watched, they saw, they allowed this place to evolve into something that it's become today. I think is incredibly impressive that a community has been able to do that. Nobody came in and told them they had to do it. They chose to as a community.
Well, thanks, Anne, for that. It is really an important time to be sensitive and reflective about how to engage in some of this work. And I very much appreciate your perspective and your involvement in this project over a number of decades, and your continued involvement now that it's really coming into its own as a really exciting and Native-led project.
Thank you very much.
Again,
appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, I am really disappointed that Maggie and Franky could not join us. I know I participated in their online fundraiser event last year, and there were a number of different voices, great presentations. I do encourage, it's in the chat now, and a couple of different places, a link to that if you want to tune in. I don't know if we should just wrap up at this point. How?
Yep, I think our time's up.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody, for participating. And why don't you, I think that people should feel free following up with, with the, on the conference site, and definitely on the Lower Phalen Creek site. We'll try to provide the organizers of the conference with any additional information that we can, that can help you to learn more about the project. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, everybody.